Hashtag they made fun of my lunchbox. Now their parents work for my food company. The smell of fermented fish sauce still haunts my dreams, not because it disgusts me, but because it reminds me of power, of the moment everything changed in that crowded cafeteria at Lincoln Elementary School 20 years ago. My name is David Chen, and I own the largest ethnic food distribution company on the West Coast, but this story begins with a 10-year-old boy clutching a scratched metal lunchbox decorated with faded dragons, sitting alone at table 12 while the popular kids pointed and laughed. "What is that smell?" Madison Wright had shrieked, her perfectly straight blonde hair swishing as she dramatically covered her nose. "It smells like something died in your lunch, David." The entire cafeteria turned to stare as I opened my grandmother's homemade banh mi, the aromatic pork and pickled vegetables suddenly feeling like weapons of mass embarrassment rather than the comfort food I had grown up loving. Tommy Peterson, whose father owned the biggest construction company in town, had grabbed my thermos and pretended to gag. "Dude, this looks like mud soup, how can you eat this garbage?" Sarah Martinez, now Sarah Peterson after marrying Tommy in what the local newspaper called the social event of the decade, had joined in with cruel precision. "My mom says foreign food is probably not even legal to eat in America. Maybe you should go back to where you came from and eat normal food." 20 years later, as I signed the employment contracts for Thomas Peterson Sr. and Maria Martinez, I remembered every word, every laugh, every moment of that humiliation that shaped the man I would become. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a humiliated 10-year-old boy built an empire from the very foods they mocked, and how fate has a twisted sense of humor when it comes to serving revenge cold. After that day in the cafeteria, I begged my grandmother to pack me normal sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly like the other kids, anything that would not draw attention to my otherness in a town where being different meant being a target. Grandmother Lily, who had survived the fall of Saigon and built a new life in America with nothing but determination and ancient family recipes, looked at me with eyes that had seen real hardship and said something that would echo in my mind for decades. "David, they laugh because they do not understand, but understanding comes to those who persist, and power comes to those who remember." She continued packing my traditional lunches, but she also began teaching me something far more valuable than conformity. She taught me the business of food, the secrets of flavor, and the patience required to build something lasting. Every afternoon after school, while my classmates played video games or watched television, I worked in her small kitchen, learning to balance fish sauce and lime juice, to understand the chemistry of fermentation, to see food not just as sustenance but as culture, as memory, as power. Grandmother Lily had been a food vendor in Saigon before the war, selling her famous pho to government officials and American soldiers alike, and she possessed an intuitive understanding of taste that bordered on supernatural. "The secret," she would whisper as we prepared massive batches of nuoc ma'am, "is not just in the ingredients, but in the intention. Food prepared with love tastes different than food prepared with anger, and food prepared with purpose, that changes everything." By middle school, the mockery had evolved into more sophisticated cruelty, with social media amplifying every embarrassment, but something strange had begun happening in our small Oregon town. Vietnamese restaurants started opening, Korean barbecue became trendy, and suddenly the exotic foods that had marked me as an outsider were being celebrated by food bloggers and Instagram influencers who had never experienced real ethnic cuisine. Madison Wright, now in 8th grade and still the undisputed queen of our school social hierarchy, posted pictures of herself at the new pho restaurant downtown, calling it so authentic and amazing, apparently unaware that the recipe was nearly identical to what my grandmother had been making for decades. The irony was not lost on me, but rather than feeling vindicated, I felt something far more dangerous. I felt inspired. That summer, instead of working at the local grocery store like most kids my age, I convinced my grandmother to let me start a small food truck business, selling her recipes at farmers markets and community events. We called it Dragon Bowl, a name that honored both my heritage and the lunchbox that had started this journey, and within weeks we had lines of customers waiting for what they now called authentic Vietnamese cuisine. The money was secondary to the revelation. These people, many of whom had children who attended my school, were paying premium prices for the same foods their kids had mocked just years earlier. Thomas Peterson Sr. approached our truck one Saturday morning, not recognizing me as the boy his son had tormented, and ordered 3 bowls of pho, raving about how his wife had been trying to recreate the flavors from their recent trip to California. "This is incredible," he had said, unaware that the child serving his food was the same one his son had reduced to tears in the school cafeteria. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" I smiled politely and told him it was a family recipe, watching as he handed me $40 for food that cost $8 to make, the profit margin so substantial that I began to understand something profound about American consumer behavior. They would pay anything for authenticity, especially when it was packaged and presented in a way that made them feel sophisticated and worldly, rather than confronted with their own ignorance and prejudice. High school brought new challenges but also unprecedented opportunities, as the food truck business expanded into catering and I found myself cooking for the same families whose children had made my elementary school years miserable. Madison Wright's parents hired us for her Sweet 16 party, a lavish affair where she and her friends took selfies with our exotic food, posting about their cultural experience while remaining completely oblivious to the fact that the boy behind the food truck was their former target. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They celebrated the culture they had once mocked, monetized the otherness they had once attacked, and praised the authenticity they had once rejected, all while remaining fundamentally unchanged in their casual racism and social blindness. But I was changing. Each successful event, each satisfied customer, each dollar earned was building not just financial capital but psychological armor, transforming the wounded child into someone who understood power in ways they never could. My grandmother watched my transformation with a mixture of pride and concern, worried that success might corrupt the values she had tried to instill, but she also recognized something else. I was becoming the kind of person who could navigate both worlds without losing himself in either. College at UC Berkeley opened my eyes to possibilities beyond our small Oregon town, but more importantly, it connected me with other first-generation immigrants who had similar stories of food-based trauma and triumph. There was Elena, whose Mexican grandmother's tamales had been mocked before becoming trendy, and Kumar, whose Indian mother's curry had been called stinky before being celebrated as exotic fusion cuisine, and together we began to understand something larger than our individual experiences. American food culture was built on appropriation and exploitation, taking the comfort foods of immigrant communities, repackaging them for mainstream consumption, and profiting from cultural elements while excluding the cultures themselves from economic participation. We called it culinary colonialism, and we decided to do something about it. The idea for Chin Foods International began in my junior year as a simple thesis project exploring supply chain optimization for ethnic food distribution, but it quickly evolved into something far more ambitious. Rather than simply documenting the problem, we would solve it by creating a company that connected authentic ethnic food producers directly with mainstream American consumers, cutting out the middlemen who had been profiting from our cultures while contributing nothing to our communities. The business model was elegant in its simplicity. We would partner with immigrant grandmothers, family restaurants, and small producers to scale their operations, providing capital, distribution networks, and marketing support while ensuring they retained ownership and control of their recipes and processes. Within 6 months of launching, we had contracts with over 200 small producers across 12 states, and major grocery chains were competing for exclusive distribution rights to what food industry magazines were calling the next wave of American cuisine. The timing was perfect. American consumers were becoming more sophisticated about food, more interested in authentic experiences, and more willing to pay premium prices for products that told compelling stories about heritage and tradition. But the real breakthrough came when we signed our first major retail contract with Whole Foods, a deal that required us to expand our operations dramatically and relocate to Portland, Oregon, just 40 miles from the small town where my journey had begun. The irony was delicious, literally and figuratively, as we opened our corporate headquarters in a converted warehouse that had once housed Peterson Construction Supplies, the same company owned by Tommy Peterson's father. Portland's food scene embraced us immediately, with local newspapers writing features about the boy genius who built a food empire from grandmother's recipes, and food bloggers documenting every aspect of our company culture. But the most satisfying moment came when we posted job openings for our management team, positions that required experience in construction project management, food service, and retail operations, skills that were abundant in our former hometown but scarce in Portland's competitive job market. The applications began arriving within days, and among them were familiar names that made my heart race with anticipation. Thomas Peterson Sr. applying for Operations Manager, Maria Martinez seeking the Customer Relations Director position, and most surprisingly, Robert Wright, Madison's father, hoping to join as Regional Sales Manager. Each application was accompanied by cover letters that detailed their relevant experience but also their newfound appreciation for diverse culinary traditions and their desire to contribute to cultural understanding through food. Language that might have been sincere but felt like cosmic justice to the boy who had once hidden his lunch in shame. The interview process was particularly enjoyable, conducting professional conversations with people who had shaped my childhood trauma while they remained completely unaware of our shared history, their focus entirely on impressing the successful young CEO who held their economic futures in his hands. Thomas Peterson Sr. arrived 15 minutes early for his interview, wearing a suit that looked expensive but slightly outdated, his confidence somewhat diminished by obvious financial stress that showed in the worn edges of his leather briefcase and the careful way he nursed his coffee. "Mr. Chin," he had said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of a man accustomed to manual labor, "I want you to know how excited I am about this opportunity. My son Tommy always said you were destined for great things." The lie was so casual, so automatic, that I almost laughed, but instead I simply smiled and asked him to tell me about his experience managing complex supply chains, watching as he tried to translate construction logistics into food distribution terminology. Maria Martinez was more honest about her circumstances, explaining that her husband's landscaping business had struggled during recent economic downturns and that she needed steady employment to support their family, her pride evident even as she asked for a job from someone young enough to be her child. "I may not have formal food service experience," she had admitted, "but I understand customer service, and I believe in treating people with respect regardless of their background, something I learned from raising my daughter Sarah in a diverse community." Again, the revisionist history was breathtaking, but I found myself appreciating her directness more than Peterson's obvious deception, and I began to understand that hiring them would be more complex than simple revenge. Robert Wright's interview was the most uncomfortable, not because he was unqualified, but because he was Madison's father, and seeing him nervous and deferential triggered memories I had thought were fully processed. He spoke eloquently about market expansion and customer demographic analysis, his background in real estate providing relevant skills for retail placement and regional development, but there was something desperate in his manner that suggested his family's financial situation was more precarious than appearances indicated. "Mr. Chin," he had said near the end of our conversation, "I want you to know that my family has always believed in the American dream, the idea that hard work and respect for others creates opportunities for everyone, and I would be honored to help build that dream with your company." The words were carefully chosen, probably rehearsed, but they contained an acknowledgement of values that had been absent during my childhood encounters with his family, suggesting that economic hardship had perhaps taught them lessons that privilege had not. I hired all three of them. The decision was not entirely based on revenge, though I would be lying if I claimed that element was absent from my thinking, but rather on a more complex understanding of justice, power, and the possibility of redemption. Thomas Peterson Sr. brought genuine expertise in logistics and operations, skills that were essential as we expanded into national distribution, and his work ethic was impeccable, perhaps enhanced by gratitude for stable employment after years of economic uncertainty. Maria Martinez proved to be exceptional at customer relations, her natural warmth and communication skills creating strong relationships with our retail partners, and her bilingual abilities were invaluable as we expanded into Hispanic markets. Robert Wright's real estate background translated perfectly into site selection and lease negotiation, saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in our first year of expansion, and his professional network opened doors that might have remained closed to a young Asian American entrepreneur. But the most interesting development was watching their children's reactions to their parents' new employment, particularly when family dynamics shifted in ways none of us had anticipated. Tommy Peterson, now working in his father's struggling construction business, initially expressed resentment that his father was working for someone he remembered as that weird Asian kid from school, but financial necessity gradually overcame childhood prejudices. Sarah Martinez, who had become Sarah Peterson after marrying Tommy, found herself in the awkward position of having her mother work for her former victim, a situation that forced uncomfortable conversations about their shared past. Madison Wright was the most resistant to the new reality, her privileged worldview struggling to accommodate the fact that the boy she had once mocked was now her father's boss, and her discomfort was visible during company events where family members were invited. The first company picnic was particularly memorable, watching former tormentors and their families navigate social situations where power dynamics had been completely reversed, their children making awkward small talk with the CEO they had once bullied. But something unexpected began happening during these interactions. Genuine relationships started forming as people discovered shared interests beyond childhood hierarchies, and the artificial boundaries that had defined our youth began dissolving. Tommy Peterson, despite his initial resentment, found himself fascinated by our supply chain innovations, his construction background providing useful insights into warehouse efficiency and transportation logistics, and we began collaborating on projects that utilized both our skill sets. Sarah Martinez Peterson, perhaps motivated by guilt or genuine curiosity, started volunteering with our community outreach programs, helping immigrant families navigate business licensing and food safety regulations, her bilingual skills and legal background proving invaluable. Even Madison Wright, after several months of careful observation, approached me at a company holiday party with something resembling an apology, though it was wrapped in so many qualifications and justifications that its sincerity remained questionable. "David," she had said, her voice carefully modulated to suggest both remorse and social sophistication, "I want you to know that I think what you have built here is really impressive, and I hope you know that kids say stupid things, but we all grew up and learned better." The non-apology apology was classic Madison, accepting no real responsibility while positioning herself as mature and evolved, but there was something in her eyes that suggested genuine discomfort with our shared history, a recognition that her childhood behavior had been genuinely harmful. I accepted her words graciously, not because they constituted real accountability, but because holding on to anger was no longer serving my purposes, and because success had taught me that the best revenge is indeed living well. The company continued expanding rapidly, our authentic approach to ethnic foods resonating with increasingly sophisticated American consumers, and within 3 years we had become the largest distributor of Asian foods on the West Coast. But the real satisfaction came from watching our success create opportunities for hundreds of immigrant families, grandmothers who could now support themselves through their cooking, small restaurants that could access national markets, and young entrepreneurs who saw our company as proof that authentic cultural expression could be both profitable and empowering. My grandmother Lily lived to see the company go public, our IPO raising over $200 million and making her the wealthiest Vietnamese immigrant in Oregon history, though she continued living in the same small house and cooking the same traditional meals that had started everything. "You remember what I told you about persistence and power," she had said on the day we rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served with perfect timing. "But do you also remember what I said about intention?" I did remember, and I understood that the intention behind our success had evolved from revenge to something more complex and ultimately more satisfying, the creation of sustainable change that honored our heritage while transforming the broader culture. The employees who had once been my tormentors had become genuine contributors to that vision, their skills and efforts helping build something larger than any individual grievance, and their economic dependence on our success had created a form of poetic justice that was more elegant than any direct confrontation could have been. Thomas Peterson Sr. eventually became our Chief Operating Officer, his logistics expertise proving essential as we expanded into international markets, and his son Tommy joined the company as a project manager, their family's financial security now entirely dependent on the boy they had once mocked. Maria Martinez was promoted to Vice President of Customer Relations, her emotional intelligence and communication skills making her invaluable in negotiating complex retail partnerships, and her daughter Sarah became our head of legal affairs, specializing in immigrant business advocacy. Robert Wright built our real estate division into a major profit center, his market knowledge helping us secure prime locations for our retail outlets, and even Madison eventually joined the marketing team, her social media skills and cultural connections proving useful in reaching younger demographics. The transformation was complete but not without its complexities. Success had created genuine relationships and mutual respect, but it had also created a form of economic control that was perhaps more powerful than any childhood revenge fantasy could have been. They were good employees, contributing meaningfully to our mission and culture, but they were also reminders of a time when power was distributed very differently, when their casual cruelty had shaped my understanding of social hierarchy and cultural value. Sometimes I wondered if they truly understood the irony of their situation, working for the boy they had once tried to shame into conformity, contributing to the success of the very cultural elements they had once attacked, their livelihoods now dependent on the authentic expression they had once mocked. But mostly I felt something I had not expected to feel, genuine happiness. The company was thriving, our employees were prosperous, and we were creating real change in how American consumers understood and appreciated immigrant cultures, transforming mockery into celebration, exclusion into inclusion, shame into pride. My grandmother's wisdom had proven prophetic, persistence had indeed led to understanding, and understanding had created a form of power that was more satisfying than any direct revenge could have been, the power to transform not just individual circumstances but entire cultural narratives. The boy with the dragon lunchbox had become a man who could feed a nation, and the foods that had once marked him as different had become the foundation of an empire that celebrated difference as strength, authenticity as value, and cultural heritage as competitive advantage. The smell of fish sauce no longer haunts my dreams, instead it reminds me of triumph, of the moment when everything changed not in a school cafeteria but in boardrooms and grocery stores across America, where the foods of my childhood had finally found their proper place at the table of American cuisine. And sometimes, late at night in my office overlooking the Portland skyline, I open a container of my grandmother's pho and remember that 10-year-old boy who thought he would never belong, grateful that his pain had purpose, that his difference had direction, and that his grandmother's love had been strong enough to transform humiliation into power, mockery into prosperity, and exclusion into empire. The dragon lunchbox sits on my desk now, not as a reminder of shame but as a symbol of transformation, and every day it reminds me that the most powerful revenge is not destruction but creation, not tearing down but building up, not returning cruelty with cruelty but transforming cruelty into opportunity. They made fun of my lunchbox, but now their parents work for my food company, and together we are feeding America with the foods they once mocked, the cultures they once rejected, and the authenticity they once feared, creating prosperity from prejudice and building bridges from the very differences that once divided us. The story ends where it began, with food, with family, and with the understanding that sometimes the most profound victories are won not through conflict but through persistence, not through anger but through excellence, and not through revenge but through the patient, deliberate construction of a better world.